This is Fountainhead Forum 20. We're going to talk to Jesse Walker, who is currently on staff at Reason Magazine as one of the assistant editors, I believe.
I'm the books editor. I edit the book section.
The book section.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he also used to work at Liberty Magazine, and I was at Liberty Magazine briefly too. So we're going to talk about our days at Liberty Magazine. How are you today, Jesse?
I'm okay. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I know you're a busy man, so one thing I always like to start out with, Jesse, is how did you become a libertarian, and how did you end up where you are today?
Yeah. Well, those are, I guess those are related questions since I'm a professional libertarian now. Um, I was a teenage leftist, kind of anarchistic leftist, so I was already interested in things like anarchism before I read anyone like Murray Rothbard, Carl Hess, David Friedman, Milton Friedman, all the usual suspects. I guess I had read Heinlein, but just because I had been a boy and I was reading science fiction novels that looked like fun. And I guess I in a way it was just a matter of reading some economics and realizing that my anti-authoritarian values were more in line with private property and voluntary exchange in this sort of vaguely syndicalist notion of the economy that I hadn't thought through very much. But as far as how I arrived at those values in the first place, I don't know. I guess I was born with them. And I remember as a Cub Scout rebelling against the requirement that we write an essay on why we need laws. So I guess there was something inside me at an early age that just didn't like people giving orders to other people. And as far as how I ended up at Reason, I mean, I had, as you mentioned, I worked at Liberty for a few years in my 20s. I know you came in as a staffer. You came in as an intern. Did you become a full-time staffer, or
No,
was it one of Bill's long internships? Because it was the long internship thing.
I was there for 6 months. That was a fairly standard internship for Bill. I mean, I know Bill treated his interns well. We got paid not much, but it was enough, and some people just did the summer thing, but some people, did 6 months. Like I started there on October. I remember specifically it was the, October 3rd, and that was, and I went till April 2nd, and I was, that was it. So yeah, it was.
Mine was my internship because I was an intern first, was 3 or 4 months. It was the beginning
Yeah.
of 1992. I had
Mm.
graduated college in December of 91, and then I spent a month shelving books at my friend's bookstore to make a little money. And then when the internship was set to start, I went out to Port Townsend. And then and he offered me a job actually at the time that I finished the internship, but I was, I don't know, when I had a girlfriend back in Ann Arbor, I had my friends back there. I wasn't quite ready to leave. I went back and I got a job at Borders, there was a year's commitment to that. And by the time the year was up, I went and was ready to go and actually work full time at Liberty, which was good for a while, and then less good, and I left. But the in general, I mean, I sold my first story to Liberty. I mean, I sold my first story to Reason while I was at Liberty, and I had sort of a freelance relationship with them throughout the 90s. And at one point in 98, Virginia Postrel was the editor then. Um, and I was doing what I knew at the time was just a year-long gig. And I had done a story for them that she liked, and she wrote me and said, "This was a delightful story. Would you be interested in applying for a job?" And unfortunately, my great story about the my application for a job turns out not to be true. I had heard through the grapevine that the two people up for the job were me and Jonah Goldberg, but I've been told since then that no, this was false. Jonah Goldberg did not apply for a job at
No.
Reason, but that would have been like a great two forking paths that Reason could have taken.
Yeah.
But yeah, I went to work at Reason and at the beginning of 1999. And though I've taken a couple of leaves of absence since then, I mean, one to work on a documentary film and one to write what became my second book. I've been on staff in one task or another for 23 years now, I guess. I was the managing editor for a while. I stepped down from that to do the conspiracy book, and when I came back, I've been editing the book review section ever since then.
Yeah, you had established quite a few freelance relationships back in the '90s while you were at Liberty, which I think you're about the only person at Liberty who really did that. I don't really know anybody
Bill
else at Liberty
Bill
who
didn't like people
really
to
did
do that. Yeah, Bill liked having people kind of under his thumb and not writing elsewhere. And
Yeah,
but it's a yeah. I wrote for Reason. I wrote for some other places too, and that helped me have some, more than just clips at this one small magazine that only libertarians read. Not only libertarians. I mean, people would come across it on the newsstand and often say, I mean, that was kind of its best period in the mid 90s. Often would say, hey, I mean, there would always be at least one story in there that was really interesting. And
yeah,
no, I'm not saying my story was really interesting. I'm saying, speaking objectively, reading other people's stuff, there'd always be at least one story in each issue in that period that was really good, and often more than one. And of course, there was some stuff that was just completely amateurish. I mean, this was a magazine that didn't pay people, and sometimes you get what you pay for,
yeah, yeah,
But at the same time, this was back before everyone was reading the internet. The internet existed,
yes,
but it was it was people who just wanted sort of a venue for their thoughts, could go to Liberty. And so there were a number of people who are pretty heavy hitters, David Friedman, Thomas Zotz,
yeah.
writing things and sending them to a Bill and Company to publish.
Yes, let's clarify. Liberty did pay the employees; they just did not pay people who submitted articles.
Yes. We who worked for
Yeah.
them were I mean,
Although,
the freelancers were not. Yeah.
although I quickly learned you're not going to get rich as a libertarian, or at least it's very difficult to get rich as a libertarian. I don't know, because I don't know if I ever saw the number, but I don't think Liberty numbers. I don't think Liberty ever turned a profit. And it sounds like Bill was always putting money into that magazine to keep it going. Not to mention, for 10 years, he gave up part of his house for it.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was a pretty big house.
Most people don't know. This was.
It was a pretty big house.
Oh yeah, Bill had a huge house and he never had kids. So yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, he didn't have kids. He had cats. I guess the cats took over parts of the house too.
Yeah, they definitely had the cats. Yes. Yeah,
and then eventually, he got. I had left by the time they actually moved into the space on Water Street downtown.
Yeah.
But I was there when everyone was going down to like scrape paint off the walls and all the other tasks. You had to be a jack of all trades to work at Liberty. It was a very small staff, and nobody was gonna get away from doing the manual labor when there was manual labor to be done.
Yeah, well, one big task, I remember, of course, was just hauling all the, Bill. We still kept a pretty good collection of back issues, and we hauled all those back issues down there, all because we had, stacks of back issues going back to number one,
Mm-hmm.
So we had to move all those out of there and get all that stuff moved, and there was just so much, there was a lot. It's interesting now, I think, with everything electronic, you don't quite have to keep that stuff, but moving books and moving magazines is certainly a whole lot of work. And we had those, and of course you go up those steps, although it was such a beautiful building. I'm sorry that I never got to see what it looked like either, but
it was, it's more fun to, and more useful, just like sort of as a reader, to be going through bound periodicals than scrolling through a PDF. I mean, the great thing about the PDF is you can do a search, and say, is this the issue I'm thinking of? Search for this term that I remember. But I one of my big sort of formative experiences, as I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and the UNC library I had access to right there, and just going through the old bound periodicals of different magazines and learning, looking at the first draft of history from different political perspectives. And, it's great to be able to do that online, and there are advantages to each one, but there are ways in which, PDFs are not a convenient way to read anything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a yeah. I don't know what Liberty would do now and then. And as far as I know, most or maybe all of Liberty is magazine because it's not being published anymore. But it is out there on the net, and you can find all that stuff to search it. So that's
Yeah.
I'm glad it's out there where we have it.
Well, it stopped publishing as a magazine around 2010, a few years after Bill died.
Mhm.
But they kept putting stuff up on the website, and they might still be. I never see anyone link to anything on it.
Yeah,
I never see, like, on Twitter or Facebook someone saying you got to read this thing in Liberty. So it's kind of off my radar screen whether or not they're still posting stuff to
yeah,
there. But it might be. I mean, a sort of ghostly remnant of it might be
yeah,
persisting. I don't know.
yeah. I don't know if Kathy, Bill's wife Kathy wanted to take over the magazine. Although to her credit, Kathy was the person who did a lot of the office work at Liberty.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
No, I mean,
she wrote our pay. She gave us our paychecks. She was she did all the non magazine, what you'd call the work that, just the work that had to be done.
yeah, she was the most grounded person
Yeah,
there
the
too.
office manager, that kind of thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And I mean, Steve Cox took it over
yeah,
after Bill died. I don't think Kathy wanted to
yeah,
edit a magazine.
yeah. And I have no idea what happened to Bill's collection of books. I would hope that it would have gotten donated to the Mises Institute or something
Mhm.
like that because he had such a collection of books.
He had all these. I remember he
Yeah.
had up in the attic all these duplicate copies of America's Great Depression by Murray Rothbard, and I
Oh,
was like,
Jesus.
and I said like to him once, Bill, could you spare one of these? And he gives me this look. I said, no, I'll pay for it, but you've got so many. Can I just buy one off of you? I don't have a copy of this. And he's like, I don't know, I'll think about it, and never got back to me. There was like,
Yeah.
I've of all the weird habits, hoarding copies of America's Great Depression
Yeah.
seemed like because he had all sorts of like rare books where I would never
Oh, yeah.
dream of asking, hey, could I buy this off of you? But
Yeah. Yeah.
those
I mean,
extra
he had,
copies of
yeah.
Rothbard were
Yeah.
something else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like first editions of Ayn Rand's novels and stuff like that. Yeah. He had some good stuff
Yeah.
too. Yeah. And he just had a lot of books too. I don't know. If I could have one superpower, it would be super speed reading. If I could read something like Atlas Shrugged in 2 hours, that would just be wonderful. but I don't know. But Bill was one of those who apparently he just went through books so quickly. Yeah. Uh, so yeah, you had so you ended up at Liberty. What did you think was some of the strengths of Liberty Magazine? I mean, we went up to what, 12,000? Was that about the most we had there subscribers or?
I don't remember.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe 10. I don't know.
yeah,
It was. I mean, it never got as high even as 20.
yeah,
So, I mean, in some ways, the strengths and the weaknesses of it. I mean, you're talking about it as a product, not
yeah.
as a
Oh
workplace,
yes, as
right?
a product. Yeah,
The strengths and the weaknesses were kind of closely entwined. The same sort of obsessive. I mean, like one of the weaknesses was the sort of obsessive. Every detail of Ayn Rand's life had to be, aired and re-aired in there. And I mean, I remember I used to joke about how we needed to have a Rand-free issue. And one time I was trying to take out this completely extraneous reference to her from an article. Like, I mean, just as an editor, it just did not belong in there. And Bill was resisting. And afterwards, it came out. He said, "I just wanted to have it not be your Rand-free issue." I said, "But Bill, she was quoted in this other article, and it made sense to quote her there." Just, "Oh,
yeah,
really? Yeah, yeah." The person, but that same sort of spirit also led to all this excavation of libertarian history that other people just weren't covering at all. Like, the life of Tom Marshall, aka El Rey, who edited Liberal Innovator, which later just became Innovator in the 60s, and then went off and disappeared in the woods. Or the Tannehills who wrote The Market for Liberty, and a willingness to be just unflinching about these people's flaws and eccentricities, because Bill understood um, that this was part of what made history interesting. And so I mean, those were closely entwined. The fact that it was kind of you know, th- we're willing to experiment and throw in all kinds of stuff led, as I said earlier, to some, less good stuff appearing. Like, if you're not paying your contributors, sometimes you're less willing to say no to somebody who's writing something for you. But at
Yeah.
the same time, it opened the door to a lot of things that I don't know that other magazines, it might have been hard to find, a place for them. And that's true not just of the libertarian analysis of whether it's the porn industry or Western utopian experiments or what have you. But also just the fact, Bill enjoyed sometimes just running a good travelogue because it was a good read, and some
Yeah.
buddy of his, would have sailed up a river or gone biking someplace and sent him, this fun, weird story, and Bill be like, let's run that. So, I mean, it's everything sort of good, everything bad about it. I can sort of see the sunny side of it as well, and everything good about it. There was a point at which it could be done to death, and you say, all right, maybe, maybe pull back from this. But there was a period in the mid '90s, sort of after it. The early years, the early issues are fine. I'm not knocking them, but there's a lot of that sort of interesting libertarian history stuff happens, in those issues. But it's very much sort of narrowly focused on libertarian in movement concerns like this. I'm writing this for a libertarian audience, and I don't think many other people are going to be interested in this.
Yeah.
And then after, I think in particular when Nathan and I were there, Nathan Crow and I, there, we really liked having other stuff in the mix and making it be more something that someone just browsing it on the newsstand would also find interesting, and it's not written for somebody who's been a libertarian since 1967. And of course, other people in the magazine, like, who've been there a while, like Tim Virkla, Clark Stokesbury, and so on, were
Yeah.
also happy to do that. Bill, I think, felt kind of, he said he wanted to do that, but he kind of, he also kind of, he liked it being his baby, and
Yeah.
he wasn't, and he kind of pulled back from some of those things. But there were a few years there where I think we really struck a good balance between those two sides of the magazine. It was
Yeah.
clearly a libertarian magazine, but any interested browser who just wants to read something interesting could also have a reason to pick it up, and maybe then start
Yeah.
reading the libertarian. The more, everything was libertarian in it, but the more in-depth, hardcore libertarian stuff too.
Tim always said that didn't really like the Ayn Rand obsession, but he said, that was what we got that was what attracted people in the newsstand. If they saw Ayn Rand, they'd get it. So
I mean, it's not like we had market research that showed
Yeah.
us that, it's yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, I believe maybe it was you. Somebody said, there's no kill like overkill.
I think that might have been Tim, but
Yeah, I think that was Tim. Yeah,
Yeah.
and Tim was so much, put so much effort into that magazine too. I mean, I was always happy because it's in a way, I think the libertarian movement misses Liberty Magazine, because this was something that brought, or at least tried to bring, all these groups of libertarians together in one place.
Mhm.
And I don't know if the Liberty movement has anything like that anymore.
Well, we have social media,
Yeah, but
it's a different kind of, yeah.
but everybody's going into their own echo chambers on social media. So yeah,
Well,
so
they emerged long enough to throw poo at the other
yeah,
chambers.
it's
So, I mean, there is a lot of overlap and intersection online.
yeah,
It's certainly easier than ever before to find the different sub movements and so on.
yeah,
But it's true that Liberty is a sort of publication that, I mean, so I should say, on the interview side of Reason, the podcast side, I know that Nick and the others
yeah,
make an effort to bring in people from different parts of the movement that aren't always necessarily their cup of tea, but to talk with them and have them say their piece. But I mean, people expect certain things from Reason. People expect certain things from other places. But even at the time, Liberty. I mean, I remember the Lou Rockwell crowd wound up being really down on Liberty.
yeah,
I mean, Rockwell wrote his paleo libertarian manifesto in Liberty, and then Bill ran a whole bunch of responses from people ranging from loving it to hating it, because in that sort of get a broad spectrum way. But they wound up just, I mean, Tim's theory was that Rockwell felt like if we weren't going to be his venue, then he wasn't going to be a part of it. I don't know. It's also true that, Bill and Rothbard just had a bit of a falling out, and I don't know to what extent A caused B and to what extent B caused A. Bill and Rothbard were both people who were always having fallings out with other folks.
Yeah.
But that ended up being a bit of a split, at least for a while. So, but even then, there was a period before then when, those folks were part of the Liberty mix too.
Yeah. Did you ever know Rothbard
No,
or ever talk with Rothbard? I
I've
know.
never met him.
I never did. I know. I just thought you might have. I never. It seems like Rothbard was always, granted, not knowing the man, but it seemed like he was always trying to find the right kind of alliance because he understood that the Liberty movement had to build alliances with people. And maybe he just said, okay, I'll try this alliance. And then, no, this isn't going to work. And that's kind of how I see maybe as a serial alliance builder and, just build an alliance. This alliance isn't going to work. And then we'll go try another alliance somewhere else.
Yeah,
I don't know.
and he didn't always have
Yeah.
the best ideas. But the
Yeah.
most interesting. It's interesting because he's been kind of rediscovered by the left, who just
Yeah.
sort of know him for his paleo period now, and he's become
Yeah.
this sort of demon figure, which is interesting because when I was in college, even as he was entering the paleo period, I mean, I remember talking with one of my I took an economics class from a socialist. We got along personally though, and I asked him what he thought of Austrian economics, and he said, "Well, you got some really right wing types like Hayek, but then you got some really progressive types like Rothbard, who I think he last read right in 1969 or so." But yeah, so there's this tendency now to hop over the heart of his career. I mean, from 1970 to 89, or arguably 87, if you want to sort of look at the Ron Paul campaign of 88 as a sort of a preview for the paleo period. But really from 70, he sort of breaks with the New Left in 1970. He breaks with the Libertarian movement, the LP, and so on in 1989. For this 19-year period, he is trying to build a self-consciously libertarian movement that is itself. It's not aligned with either the left or the right, although it's willing to do issue by issue stuff and bring in people, obviously. Um, and that, I think, when I was kind of coming up, people thought of as like your core Rothbard period. And nowadays, there's some people that are nostalgic for the hard right period at the end of his life. Some people are nostalgic for the new left period. Again, you have these people who are like writing about him from the outside and who sort of it's like, well, he supported Strom Thurmond when he was an undergraduate, and much later he and Pat Buchanan, and you jump over almost everything in between, except for a few cherry-picked stuff, which I don't think he had these very distinct periods of his career that you kind of have to look at all together and see how they fit together. I first encountered him through his New Left period, which was probably useful for me as I said, teenage leftist looking at libertarians, and here's this guy kind of speaking my language. But it's I don't know, there are a lot of different. I actually I tweeted the other day. I picked out an excerpt from his letter to Innovator in 1964, basically endorsing LBJ for president. Or his thing was,
Wow.
we must defeat Goldwater. He doesn't say I endorse, but he says everybody must, or if you're a libertarian who participates in politics,
Wow.
you've got to, we all must organize to stop Goldwater and all Goldwaterite candidates. And the main reason for that was because of, the fear of nuclear war and Goldwater's foreign policy. Of course, Johnson turns out to be a pretty
Yeah.
hawkish and I said, we've got your right wing libertarians who like his paleo period, and you got your left wing libertarians who like his new left period. But where are the centrist libertarians who are nostalgic for him getting behind Lyndon Johnson and before that Adlai Stevenson? This is the
Yeah.
forgotten center left Rothbard.
Yeah. It's shocking considering how awful Johnson turned out to
Well,
be.
the three presidents whose reelection campaigns, in Johnson's case, I guess it's technically not a reelection since he became president the first time, not through an election, but through an assassination. But the three whose we'll call them reelection campaigns Next, Rothbard endorsed for Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and George H.W. Bush, which is not which are like the three least Rothbardian presidents
Oh,
of his lifetime.
yeah,
So
it's really strange.
yeah.
Well, there wasn't. There really was. Well, he might not even have known about Hospers in '72 because he was only on
Oh,
the ballot in 2 states. But yeah,
he knew about him, and he
yeah,
was and he at the time thought the idea of the Libertarian Party was just not worth doing. He changed his mind a couple years
yeah,
later, and he actually ran some interesting critiques of Hosper's campaign. His responses to some and again, I should say, I don't think, I could be wrong, I don't think Rothbard ever voted in an election. I don't think he registered because he didn't want to be called up for juries. That's the story I've been told, at least. So I don't know that he voted for these people, but he would talk about who the lesser evil is, and he wound up preferring Johnson to Goldwater, Nixon to McGovern. I think those are both cases where he was very much wrong. And he wound up, he was in '92, he was initially supporting Perot, or being friendly about Perot, but after Perot dropped out and came back on, Rothbard was like, he's a flake. And he wound up preferring Bush to Clinton, which there are some individual issues where I think that makes sense. But again, you look at the two presidencies, I think, Bush Senior wound up being the greater evil. So Rothbard often made wrong calls in terms of who he was going to align himself with.
yeah. I think Clinton was probably the least destructive president in my lifetime. It's hard to say, but none of them were particularly good.
When were
Yeah,
you born? Are you like, you're like,
71. I was so Nixon was president when I was born. I think
okay,
you same. Yeah, you were also, yeah. So
yeah.
I say it's why I don't say good. I just say least destructive. But
Yeah, I would actually argue Carter was the least bad of our
yeah, yeah,
lifetime. You can
yeah,
make a case for Ford if you focus it less
yeah,
on who he was and what he wanted, and more
yeah,
on how he was so boxed in that post Watergate era
yeah,
from doing anything, and
yeah,
how both the left and the right completely distrusted him.
yes,
And so I can see
yeah,
nostalgia for Ford, and then Carter. He deregulated a lot of things. He was the least militarist president of my lifetime, which counts for a
yeah,
lot. I mean, although I can criticize him both on
yeah,
for regulatory decisions and foreign policy decisions,
yeah.
but
Uh,
you know,
yeah. Tell us a little bit about your book on radio, Rebels in the Air, I believe. Yeah.
yeah, Rebels on the Air, that came out in 2001, um, about a week before 9/11, so got a lot of attention. You can imagine how that went. But yeah, New York University Press published it, still in print, still occasionally hear from people who read it. When I started writing that, I mean, what I was aiming to do in that was to, on the one hand, talk about the history of the sort of the, and I started writing this around 1995 or six. I guess I should say, I did a feature for Reason, the second story I ever did for Reason in '95 about a pirate radio broadcaster in California,
Yeah.
and used that also as a springboard for talking about some FCC history, how we got the agency and the powers that it has, and whether we'd be better off without it. So and some of like stuff from that article wound up in the book, but I wasn't sort of consciously outlining and then writing a book until a year later. But at any rate, I'm sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself.
Yes.
I was trying to, on the one hand, talk about the history of why radio was so controlled, so people were so unwilling to experiment, why there was so little innovation and nonconformity and competition, and on the flip side, to talk about the people who nonetheless did it. In some cases, going outside the law to do it,
Yeah.
and who are sort of the rebels of the title. And I did the first chapter or two, or more sort of synthetic history. I was drawing together. I did some primary source research, but I was mostly, there was a group of historians who were who tended to be libertarians, who were looking at um, one part of the story, and another group of historians who tended to be leftists, who were looking at another part of the story. And I was weaving their evidence together and showing the larger tale to be told in terms of like why the Federal Radio Commission and then the FCC were created, and what stations they then promptly drove off the air. And then as it went on, there was much more just primary research, me interviewing people, talking about radio stations, both legal and illegal, um, the ill effects of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which, offered, whose subsidies, there was, gave people incentives to blandify
Mhm.
their programming in different ways. So anyway, it just turned, the book turned 20 a year ago, and so much of it, in some ways it feels very out of date now, because not just because people listen to the radio much less, but because nowadays it's so easy to broadcast. We're doing a podcast, right? All the
Yeah,
podcasts and live streams, it has opened up all this space that wasn't there. I actually did, I think, a pretty good job of predicting where internet radio would go in the last chapter, but it was a lot of the concerns that animated it. I mean, like when I started writing this book, I thought it was going to be a requiem for good radio, and that these pirates I was interviewing were going to be like the last the last standard bearers, and as the cold dark night falls on the AM and FM dials. And but by the time I finished it, I was actually very optimistic about where things were heading, and I think I'm right about that. But
yeah,
I wound up being right about that. But at the same time, like if you read, I don't have it in front of me, but like you read the final paragraphs of the book, and me talking about the indie revolution and indie media revolution. I don't mean indie media, the site. I'm sorry. I should say independent media revolution,
yeah,
and what it means, and what the upsides and the downsides are going to be. I mean, I had some line at the last. I might get it slightly wrong, but it's like, if it also means an outpouring of smut, paranoia, and drivel, so be it. At least this is our smut,
yeah,
paranoia, and drivel. Um, and I, it's not a bad description of the ups and downs of social media today.
yeah. There,
Yeah.
I mean, you look back to that time and said, what could be more libertarian than pirate radio? But nowadays, there really isn't a need for pirate radio anymore, is there? I mean, with
Well,
podcasting or
it
YouTube or whatever, you can broadcast other ways and just avoid the
yeah,
public airwaves.
you can. I mean, but the William Gibson line, "The future is here." It's just not evenly distributed.
Yeah,
I mean, there are places where analog private broadcasting, certainly around the world,
yeah,
is still a valuable way of getting messages out. And it was actually only this year, the in terms of listening to AM and FM radio versus listening to stuff via devices, and that includes listening to radio station via like mobile devices. But just in terms of where people were getting their audio, only this year did the according to, I think it was Edison Research, did the number of people of hours spent listening via mobile devices go above the number of hours spent listening AM and FM radio. So there still are a lot of people who are listening to the old media in the old way. These revolutions take time, but yeah, it's way different than it was 1995 and 96 when I started writing about this stuff.
yeah. Just having 2 days on the road, I was listening mostly to just stuff on my phone,
Yeah.
which was cut, which I hadn't really done before. I never don't even think I turned on the radio. It's kind of funny how that's happened. I mean, and and of course sometimes and of course one thing about your car radio is you've got to change it now and then. But I do like it. One thing I do like about traveling, listening to radio, is it kind of gives me a feel for where I am.
Yeah.
I'll hear the local advertisements there and stuff like that. It just says, okay, yeah, you're really in Nashville or wherever. But
Yeah, you travel. I can remember driving through the West at different times in the 90s, and you go through these
yeah,
rural areas and you find these hardcore right-wing talk radio shows, and then you enter the college town and you find the one little funky place
yeah,
playing punk rock and talking about veganism or whatever. You are kind of getting like the spirit of each place you go through, and
yeah,
that's but it's true
mhm,
now that I'm able to plug my phone through my car stereo, it's kind of like a all right. I'm often listening
Yeah.
just to the podcasts while I
Yeah.
drive. So
Do you worry about what's going to happen with about what's going on with the net right now? Because I'm really worried that they're whatever the feds do, they'll likely do something very bad.
yeah,
Uh,
I feel like there's part of me that says, you know what, we've never before had. I mean, if you think of not free speech as in the negative right, First Amendment, Congress, but the sort of the broader, the ability to create and project, whether it's audio, video, or text, and get it to an audience. There's part of me that would say, we've never had that better now than in the past. And then I think I said, maybe we never had it better than the past 10 years ago, and it's been slowly sliding
yeah.
away since then. And the good news is I mean, it's a lot of the really apocalyptic takes are from people who don't remember how bad things were 25 years ago, let alone in the three network era. I mean, 25 years ago, you still had,
Yeah.
cable and the satellite TV and the beginnings of the net. Even though at that point,
Yeah.
like audio over the net was like, you were downloading a file and it took a while and then you had to listen to it offline. It's a actually this is a side, but you'll think this is funny. I can remember when I first got online in like 1987 or so, but I was offline for a few years. Like when I first moved to Port Townsend, and then when I hooked back up to the net, and the web had come along, and I was
Yeah.
sort of getting myself reacquainted, and I had started finding these music communities, and I, for the first time, there's like, it's now been released as an official CD, but I knew there were these Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash sessions recording together, of which only one song had been released, but there were bootlegs, and I acquired the bootleg online. But back then
Yes.
in 1996, acquiring the bootleg online did not mean going to a torrent site or just finding it on YouTube or something like that. No, no, no. It meant I emailed somebody who said he had it, and he dubbed it and sent me an analog audio cassette. So that was trading music online
Yes.
almost 3 decades ago. So things have really changed, and a lot of people don't understand how much freedom they still have. To me, it's not like 1984 now. It's like Brazil. It's like there's this structure that's trying to be totalitarian, but it's filled with all its leaks and loose wires and so forth.
Yeah.
And you can almost always route around things. And when they do, when they do clamp down on something, it winds up bringing more attention to whatever it is they're trying to suppress.
Yeah.
But of course I worry about it. Of course I really dislike it. I wish that the debates about it weren't so filtered through these partisan lens. I mean, there's a lot of the people who complain about the sort of public-private partnership of censorship on Twitter and Facebook are conservatives, and it's very important to them that it be just prejudice against the right, and they're not,
Yeah.
and they sort of tune out other people being suppressed in this way, and also argue that this is why Trump wasn't reelected. The sort of nonsense idea that Hunter Biden's laptop was going to change votes. I think it's bad that they clamped down on that story, because it's bad that they be able to clamp down on that story. But that was not going to change the election.
Yeah.
And I can make that case if you disagree, but I can state it pretty firmly. But that's not what was important about it. And then there are these people, not on the left, who like know enough not to trust the authorities because they have living memory of being repressed. But the sort of center left, the MSNBC left, who are sort of like, how dare you suggest that there's anything bad about trying to? Don't you know it's disinformation? Which means anything they disagree with. So I mean that really kind of, and this sort of ability to sort of um, take yourself out of like this sort of whose partisan advantage is it for these 2 weeks, and think a bit long term. That was one of the weirdest things about the Trump years, where all these people saying, we have to defend all these 3-letter agencies that Trump controlled. These liberals are like, oh, like Trump, we've got to defend the FBI and all these folks against, and it's you do realize that that the person you're most afraid of is the one who can use these agencies right now. But even when there was some direct repression during like the 2020 protests, it was interesting to see which people on the left could generalize from that, as some could, and which people on the left just thought it was, oh, well, they're abusing the system. Clearly, we need to get the right people in charge of the Department of Homeland Security, which, of course, we cannot live without, because who could imagine in America without a Department of Homeland Security? It must have been there since like 1794 or something, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the most obvious things too, Jesse, was Facebook deleted a bunch of accounts of people who were on Joe Jorgensen's staff. I mean,
oh, was that when they did like the whole like there were like anarchist militia and QAnon? I think were like
well,
the three
no,
big
this was
categories.
Caitlin Cloven, I know, was one of Joe Jorgensen's volunteers. I mean, so you're actively deleting accounts of Facebook accounts of people who are actively working on a presidential campaign. I mean, we did have. I know, for example, that with the old media, a newspaper, if a newspaper charges $100 for an ad by a Democrat, they have to charge $100 for the ad by the Republican. But if you're going to charge, there's a lot of things here that seem like they're trying to put their finger on the scale, so to speak. But I think if you have enough media outlets, they're all going to balance each other out. But yeah, there's definitely some things going on here. But as you pointed out, we can remember when there were 12 stations on the TV, and we can remember when we had typewriters and had to use those clanky typewriters. It certainly is a lot easier to get your message out there, but I also think that's also created such a glut of messaging that now you have to search through all this and go through all this, and it's
actually Virginia wrote a piece at sort of the beginning of the web era that I think has held up really well, called The Age of the Editor, that arguing that people were arguing that she was responding to people, among other things, to people who are sort of feeling that we're heading for this era where everything is unedited stream. And she says, no, it actually becomes much more important to have a good, trusted editor who you, the consumer, choose, who can guide you to, be your Sherpa, through this. And I think we all do that. I mean, I know that there are a lot of people I follow on Twitter because they're going to find interesting stuff and share it with me and be like they're the editor-in-chief of their own private magazine. And that's again another power that we have now that we didn't really have 30 years ago, 25 years ago.
Yeah, and certainly we have that power by looking through top reviewers on Amazon and things like that. Getting back to Trump and stuff, you also wrote another book about the history of American conspiracy theories.
Yeah, which Trump is not in. It came out in 2013. And one of my regrets about it is that when I had the little discussion of the birthers, I said, oh, I should have thrown in like a quote from Trump or something so he would at least be in this book. But he's not. It stops in the Obama era. But hopefully my hope was, as I wrote it, that the book would be a toolkit that people could then use to understand conspiracy theories and so forth that emerge after it comes out. And I think some people have done that. But yeah, this book is a deep history of American conspiracy theories, like going back to the colonial times and sort of rejecting the idea that conspiracy theories are just something for the fringe out there, the far left, the far right, those weirdo libertarians, but pointing out that the fear of conspiracy has been present across the political spectrum, very much including the center, people in power, who often, gin up, fears in order to reinforce their power. That often doesn't get called conspiracy theories because it's being advanced by the people at the heart of power, and conspiracy theory has become a sort of pejorative term. So it often only becomes called a conspiracy theory retroactively as people look back a few
Yeah.
decades later. One interesting thing about the Trump era is you actually had just Democrats and Republicans accusing each other of spreading conspiracy theories in real time. And of course, Trump himself was kind of, I mean, there have been lots of conspiracy theorist presidents, but Trump was shameless about it in a certain way. I mean, shameless in
Yeah.
the sense of he would he would clearly make accusations just because of who was his enemy that day, um, and not because of what he believed. I don't think he really believed there was any connection between Ted Cruz's family and the Kennedy assassination. And one way I can say that is because, after Cruz then, dropped out and endorsed Trump, eventually endorsed Trump, you stopped hearing that sort of thing from Donald Trump, right? Suddenly
Yeah.
Ted Cruz was on his team. But also shameless in the sense that when someone asks him to back it up, he just points to the National Enquirer. He doesn't care that that's a disreputable source. Most people, try to, usually somebody in power will say, well, the intelligence community backs up my belief that Saddam Hussein is plotting to assemble weapons of mass destruction and perhaps use them against Americans. So that's certainly a couple differences of the Trump era, but it still fits into the longer course of American history as I laid it out in the book.
One of the things that bothers me about conspiracy theories and is they seem so anti-ideological. It's like, I mean, okay, so do you oppose Obama's healthcare plan just because you don't think he's American? Are you saying you would support it if he was American? This is not how you fight bad ideas.
Yeah.
It seems to me it's like a losing battle. I mean,
Well, I mean, I would say the birther seed. I mean, if I were to
yeah,
expand that book into the present era, one point I made was that the birther seed is what ended up corrupting. I mean, God knows there were problems with the Tea Party movement, but there was a
yeah,
big libertarian strain to it, and Trumpism doesn't just grow
yeah,
out of birtherism in the sense that that was
yeah,
the beginning of Trump's um, sort of rise, return to the political sphere. It also becomes a sort of, well, this guy isn't really an American, and that's our objection. And we're not even. I'm a guy. I mean, Trump is a guy who, was uh, unapologetic about the eminent domain abuse that his companies engaged in. I mean, there was no sort of principled anti. Even when he wound up being on the right side of an issue, it wasn't because of a principled, uh, belief in individual liberty or limiting state power. And I think that Trump, him, and birtherism kind of sort of uh, set the stage for that. I mean, and it sort of, I'm not saying that it led to it or it was necessary for it to happen, but you could see that as kind of, this is the side of what's happening on the right now that is eventually going to become dominant again,
yeah,
because that's the side that's usually dominant. The right is not usually driven by limited government concerns. There was
yeah,
a brief interval. That they even seemed to be. And even then you had some anti-immigration stuff, in the midst of all the anti-tax and anti-regulatory stuff of the Tea Party
yeah.
movement.
And they've never been ideological, but the whole, and I don't say I don't use conspiracy theories necessarily as a term of derision. I mean, when people say, well, that's just a conspiracy theory, I usually respond to them. So do you think Vince McMahon's wrestling is real? It's like, I mean, there are conspiracies all around us. I mean, look at all the times people have, been paid money to throw sporting events or something like that.
The
I
world
mean,
is filled with
yeah,
small conspiracies. I mean, the really
yeah,
improbable ones, the one where there's like one small group pulling all the strings and everything always goes their way. That's the other thing is like, I think most political
yeah,
conspiracies, or a
and
lot of them, fail. But yeah, no, I mean,
yeah,
I certainly, and in the book, I do talk about genuine, real
yes,
conspiracies that
yes,
done
and
by the FBI, the CIA, and so
yeah,
on. And, you know,
a conspiracy of 19 men to hijack 4 planes on
yeah,
September 11th. I mean, that's a conspiracy too. I mean, they
yep.
obviously got together and agreed to do this. Or the invasion of Normandy was a
Mhm.
conspiracy. We're all going to work and send these ships and invade Normandy. It's
Yeah, and I should say I do not use it as a pejorative
yeah,
in my book. but I come at the topic from a bunch of different angles,
Yeah.
and I deliberately wrote it in a way that I said, you know what, I'm not writing this either to espouse or debunk conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes I do lay out the evidence that something isn't true, especially when I'm going like hundreds of years ago and no one's going to be familiar with anything, that other than what I tell them. And sometimes I say, hey, this really happened. But ultimately, it is a history of the things people believed and the way those beliefs affected history, and making the case, not just what I said earlier, that they've been present across the spectrum among elites as well as everyone else, but that even when a conspiracy theory isn't true, if people believe it, if it catches on and it spreads, that says something true about their anxieties and experiences in their
Yeah.
lives. And if you want to understand the American story, understanding the history of people's fears is part of that.
And I think we've actually reached a point where at least one conspiracy theory can now be considered mainstream. I mean, Epstein didn't kill himself. I mean, you can find almost any faction of Americans who says, yes, Epstein didn't kill himself.
Well, there,
Whether they be on the left, right, conservative, atheists, whatever.
That's
That's
like
a
what
mainstream conspiracy theory.
that's what the Kennedy assassination used to be. I mean,
Yeah.
I think you still have, although you never had a majority of Americans backing
Yeah.
any one specific Kennedy conspiracy theories. You almost always,
Yes.
not at the very beginning, but almost always had a plurality and usually a majority. And at one point in the 80s, the polls were over 80% saying Oswald did not act alone killing John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And I think the Epstein suspicions cross ideological boundaries in the same way.
Apparently, yeah, yeah. But yeah, I didn't realize it was that high among Kennedy assassination believers. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it was.
But yeah, but a lot of these people have never really gotten a hearing because I know I don't know how many different Epstein theories there are, but I'm sure there are probably different ones. But the amount on Kennedy, of course, and but have these conspiracy theories really accomplished anything anyway? I mean,
I mean, I will
yeah,
say that if you honestly believe something happened, it
yeah,
behooves you to try to get the truth out.
oh
And
yeah,
and there actually was recently. I always, when people say, what are some conspiracy theories that are not officially held conspiracy theories you think are true? I had a couple of examples I would go to, and one of them I can't go to anymore because the official story has actually changed. That the wrong people were arrested for the Malcolm X assassination. They actually officially
yeah, mhm,
they had the official statements in New York that we had this guy, one of these guys we had behind bars, did not
yeah,
belong there, and they have not said, what there's a lot of, it's not proven, but I think well-grounded suspicions that perhaps police had advanced knowledge of that, of the plot to kill him.
yes,
But that's certainly an open question now, and absolutely, I mean, whether or not it accomplishes something larger, if it is, in case we'll take it for granted that is indeed true. Or actually, we'll go beyond that. We'll say something absolutely everyone
yes,
acknowledges as true, which is that the FBI and Chicago police deliberately killed Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party,
yes,
and for political reasons, and spread lies about acting in him firing at them first, afterwards, which turned out not to be true.
yeah,
It is, I mean, exposing that is both good in the immediate sense of you've got to expose these people who did this criminal thing, but also because it makes the larger point of the power of these police agencies and the abuses of these police
yeah,
agencies, and what else are they doing, and what else will they try to do, and what limits on their power do you need to put in place. So
yeah. And
that,
hopefully we can get those limits done. And this does bring up, we can say free Leonard Peltier. That's the first time we said that on here. I mean, all my libertarian friends talk about Snowden and Ross Ulbricht, and I agree, and I agree with them. But Leonard has been in jail a lot longer than any of those guys.
he's going to die pretty soon. I
He
mean, at this
probably,
point,
he sadly will.
the
Yeah,
arguments about him have become
yeah,
a lot of, I mean, a lot of the dominant ones have become, he's old, let him out,
yeah,
to die in peace. So we'll see.
yeah. But yeah. It's been interesting watching. What else? Should we say about Liberty Magazine, Jesse? It's been a good talk, so.
What else did you want to say about Liberty Magazine? This is
I'm proud of my days at Liberty Magazine, Jesse. I mean, we had our quirks, and I do think sometimes we got articles also that people couldn't get published elsewhere. That I think that was,
it has. I mean, I will say,
yeah,
as much as I enjoyed Nick enjoyed Bill as a reporter when it was like him going off on his bike to a town and writing about what he found. I mean, that was Bill at his best, writing those pieces. He really was not a good investigative reporter. He did not have. He once did a piece where he sort of brought me in. He had done this article about. I think it was the one about whether Rose Wilder Lane had ghost written her mother's Little House books. I think that might have been the one. He brought me in and says, if so Jesse, you've got experience as a reporter. He means I worked at my college paper. This is the kind of experience he's drawing on.
Yes.
Do you think is it okay to like just run a quote without saying where you got it from? And I thought he was talking about stuff like a press conference he watched on C-SPAN, because he would like watch those for his Whitewater. Or they say, yeah, sure. And he says, yeah, because I just got a call from this reporter. He's so upset that I reused all these quotes from his report on Rose Wilder Lane in this thing without crediting him. And I thought, wait, well, hang on, Bill, those quotes weren't yours. Those actually you should have done. But he was kind of, and he had after I left, I remember he wrote a letter to, he ran something that made some claims about Reason. I think it was Reason circulation or ad rates. I don't remember what. And he got these letters, a letter, I think, from Virginia saying, you got these numbers wrong. And he then responded with this whole elaborate thing of how he determined their, whatever it was, ad rates or circulation or whatever, based on these bits of information and extrapolating from them. And I'm reading this and say, Bill, you should have just called them and asked. Yes. I could go on and tell other stories, but I mean, there were just lots of lapses like that. And I don't know. I in some ways I'm proud of it, but also he was not always an honest person, and I kind of part of me feels like I should have left earlier when I sort of realized, just some of his business practices that I could not be on board with. But I don't know. It's certainly an interesting part of my life, and I like a number of things I wrote, and definitely a lot of the things that he edited and published by other hands.
I think we really were. Sometimes I think Liberty was better for what we were trying to do than what we actually accomplished. But I think it's, I think the Liberty, I think, I don't know what, I don't know what it would look like now either. Would Bill would Bill have a podcast? Would Tim have a podcast? Or, well, Tim left, but
Tim has a podcast, I think.
Yeah. Tim has his own podcast now and then, or, it's really interesting. And of course,
Bill would have been a really good podcaster. Yeah, that guy would have long tone conversations that were infinitely interesting. And he had all those contacts. He would have been a good interviewer for something.
Oh, like that. And other people, of course, Brian Doherty also is at Reason. He also got started at Liberty. And of course, Scott Reed has done very well up in Canada. He got started at Liberty. I mean, there's a few other people who got started at Liberty who have done some interesting things since then. I mean, it's definitely, it was a launching pad, and there are some things from that library I wish I'd gotten copies of them, because Bill that was an education in Ayn Rand I could not have gotten anyplace. I mean, he had Sid Greenberg's Ayn Rand and Alienation, which was almost impossible to find. He had this other essay from Robert Bidnotto called Libertarianism, Follies and Fallacies. I've asked Bidnotto, where's that essay? He doesn't have a copy of it, because I'd love to go back and read that again. Bill had so much stuff. I don't know if he actually read that stuff or they were just books on the shelf, but Bill was just so, and Bill,
and also, I mean, like he had so many,
a lot of different things too.
He had old zines. I mean, that were really hard to find. And there's actually one thing I was working hard to get my hands on when I wrote the conspiracy book and could not find. Um, I mean, you might. I think this was before you got there, but you might have remembered Clark writing about it. Oliver North, his initial reaction to Waco was to defend the cops, and that sort of that class consciousness of him as an
Yeah.
agent of the state, and and then later when he realized that his new audience on the populist right didn't cotton for that, he really backpedaled and was like, says,
No,
"Oh no, I
gee,
was just saying you can't blame them for their mission," which is not what he said. So, but I was looking for, I had Clark's article about it, but I wanted to find the actual thing from his like newsletter or regular facts or whatever, and I could not dig it up anywhere. I mean, Bill would have had it. That's how we had it in the first place.
oh yeah, Bill would have. Yeah, Bill would have had it. He had a lot of
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, I remember looking at a collection of some. Bill would also collect things out of magazines. Like he had collected letters to the editor of National Review after they published that review of Atlas Shrugged, and Rothbard wrote a response. John Chamberlain wrote a response. There were quite a few prominent people who had written responses to that, just basically saying, "Why'd you attack Atlas Shrugged?" And it was so. That was all. That was a great education with that library. It was just so amazing what we learned there. It's and I still basically consider anybody who worked at Liberty Magazine family. It's always going to be that way for me. It's just because it was ultimately the best 6 months of my life. What I learned there, I loved Port Townsend. It is such a beautiful place. I mean, I love Washington.
It's a beautiful place, but man, it was isolating. I mean,
Yeah,
I was in my mid-20s and going down to and this is a place where people leave there when they turn 18, and then they move there, in their 30s when they've gotten married and they want to raise their kids someplace nice.
yeah.
So I was heading down to Seattle to socialize, which is
Hmm.
a 90-minute drive if you catch the ferry at just the right time, or
Yeah.
2-hour drive if you go. So it was not, but yeah, no, it is. I mean, and if you're going to live in rural Washington, that's the nicest place to live. I mean, I
Oh yeah.
compare that to like Bremerton or whatever. It was definitely, both prettier and sort of more culturally lively. They had all those used bookstores and, musicians playing, and two different movie theaters. And, that's,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting experience, something you won't forget. And it's not really changed. It's not really changed that much in Port Townsend.
when were you last there? I haven't been
I
there
was
in
last there
20
around
years.
Labor Day weekend of 2019, so it really hadn't changed much
Right.
in the peninsula. I mean, people said they could have bridges, but they don't want them because they figure they'll get changed too much on the other side. And it's really not changed that much. It still has the same feel. It's a
Yeah, I have not. I was in
yeah,
Seattle a little more than a decade ago visiting some people, but we did not make it up to Port Townsend. And I,
yeah.
I don't think I've been there since the 90s.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, me being there from October to April, all this stuff got closed for avalanches.
Oh, really?
For those 6 months. For example, I never got a chance to go up on Hurricane Ridge when I was out there.
Oh, wow.
Because if I'd done it as soon as I got out there, I probably would have. But then by the time November rolled around, it was closed because everything closes because there's so much snow up in the high elevations that
Mhm.
they just closed the roads entirely. So I never got a chance to go to I went to Hurricane Ridge and did some other things that I never got to see. It was.
Did you ever take the ferry out to like Whidbey Island or any of those places?
I took the ferry once across. When I was out there, I did take the ferry once from Port Townsend over to the other side, and I went up to British Columbia that day. That was the
Oh,
one
wow.
time.
Well, that's a longer
Yeah,
trek than I took.
yeah, I knew. Yeah,
Yeah.
I knew somebody up in British Columbia, so I went up there one day, and who's no longer with us. But it's and of course, we could get CKKQ out of Victoria up there too. We got Canadian radio stations from there in Port Townsend, which was interesting. Yeah, that was certainly a very interesting time. You know, I, one funny story I've got to share too is that we were in the office once and Bill started talking about Ayn Rand. He says, Mina and I were in the office. He said, I think I've read Ayn Rand's novels 10 times. And then he says, don't say that. And I said, Bill, you said that on C-SPAN. And he said that on that What is Living and Dead in the Philosophy of Ayn Rand discussion. He's talked about the number of times he read Ayn Rand's novels, and it's like, yeah, and we never talked about the conferences. How the editors' conferences. Yeah.
Whereas I'm someone who read Anthem
Yeah.
once,
Yeah.
and that's it. Yeah, I mean, I've read some of her nonfiction, but like I've never read Atlas Shrugged. At a certain point, I enjoyed. I as long as Matt Welch is around, I will not be the most prominent libertarian who has never read Atlas Shrugged. But unless he breaks down and reads it, but I kind of enjoy the perversity of it. Yeah,
I don't know if Tim's ever read it.
I think he probably
Tim
has.
Verkle it. Well,
He
Tim,
certainly read like the Fountainhead, I think.
Well, Tim Verkle used to say, I won't read Atlas. I won't read anything longer than Bleak House until I read Bleak House.
Yes, I remember that.
And he said, so he kept it. I think that was his way of not reading Atlas Shrugged. Tim never thought much of Rand. It was, there were people.
Bill, I mean, between a number of because I was never like I softened on Rand a bit around 2009 or so, because for a long time there was a kind of aside from my philosophical differences with her, I felt like her impact on the libertarian movement was not always good. You know what certain sorts of Randians are like.
Yeah.
And I kind of reached this point where I said, you know what? I am blaming her too much for her most obnoxious followers. She has some responsibility for that, but not all of it. And number two, during the reaction to the Tea Party movement, when she became this kind of demon figure on the left, people regularly made claims about her that weren't true. And that made me sort of want to do some defense of her. I'm not claiming that she didn't like black people or just nonsense like that, And so I softened a bit. And nowadays I look at, the Hoppians, and I think, oh my goodness, I miss having the Randians as our biggest problem. I shouldn't say like the Peikoff Randians is our biggest problem, that we've got these Hoppian, crypto fascist assholes running around. So there's, I part of me like misses the day when I like the biggest divide is me having some philosophical differences with Ayn Rand and not caring for the Ayn Rand Institute as an organization.
Yeah, it's all been rather strange, though. I think it's hard to say. I don't know if there's anybody who's a purist anymore. But this reminds me though of that ad campaign. Carl Hess and Murray Rothbard. Where they're like saying what they disagree on. Says we both agree that we love Liberty Magazine.
And and of course, Bill and Tim wrote that ad. And there was the part in there where Carl Hess supposedly says, Murray Rothbard hates the hermeneutic approach to economics. I think it's good common sense. And apparently, Carl Hess was like, I have no idea what the hermeneutic approach to economics is. And Bill's like, oh, either Bill or Tim, whoever he's talking with, don't worry, it'll be funny, Carl. It'll be funny. So
that was hilarious. I didn't realize that was. So I guess you didn't get to work with Carl Hess, didn't you? He seemed like
I did edit a few of Carl Hess's things, and I did once in my life meet him. And of course, I've met his son a few times. Carl Hess Jr. is a great guy. I wanted to write. I mean, I had hoped to be my third book was going to be a Carl Hess biography, and then I found out someone else was working on one. I don't think there's a room in the marketplace for two competing Carl Hess volumes. But it was going to be my. I wish him well, and I hope the book comes out soon. Because if it doesn't, and I wind up writing it instead, a lot of the people I'd want to talk to would be gone. But I do sometimes. I go trolling through old Carl Hess related materials because I think he's a great, not just an interesting character in himself, but a great springboard for understanding a whole lot of recent American history that people miss. And I've found all sorts of fun, bizarre documents where he makes cameos in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even afterwards. So,
it's interesting to think that it's a shame Rothbard opposed Goldwater. I guess I can see why. But Hess actually written speeches for Which
The Carl Hess is like the one person to write speeches, who to both ghostwrite speeches for Barry Goldwater and ghostwrite literature for the Black Panther Party. So
and I also remember that even after Carl died, Bill still gave Therese Hess a subscription.
Yeah,
it gave her a free subscription. I mean, Bill did not give many things away, but that was one thing he gave away. It was
but before we go, and we have to say, I do have one Bill story to tell that you made me think of with Carl Hess. Is I can Bill sometimes criticized Carl in a friendly way, but he did. I remember him prefacing it, his criticism once. But I consider Carl a true friend, and I remember. Not saying out loud because it would be mean, if he's your true friend, why does he always why do his letters to you all start with "Dear Bob"? He thought the R in R.W. Bradford was for Robert, and it was always Bob.
No, it was, yes. Just to clarify, it was Raymond William Bradford. That was his name. I mean, I've heard other people make that claim. He did not give out his first name very often, but that was his name.
It was Raymond. That's right. Billy Ray Bradford.
Oh gosh, he would have hated that.
He did, in fact, hate it, because I think I told him once that he could go by that, and he did not find that an amusing idea at all. I guess that's the perfect note to end on, right?
Yes. Well, you can find Jesse Walker's writings at Reason Magazine and other elsewhere. As I've said, Jesse's probably the most colorful libertarian I know. So that's why I wanted to bring him on here. So, and of course, you can find my novel Escape from the Village on Amazon, and please hit the like button and subscribe to this show. And this has been Fountainhead Forum 20, and have a great day, Jesse. Go back to work.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Yeah, Jesse. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.